hear me?
Hi, Mandy. Yes, I can hear you.
I can hear Candace. So Candace, we can have our own private meeting. They can't fix this. Morning, everyone. Can you hear me? Okay, NBI events. I'm trying to say something, but I don't think you can hear me. I think Candace still can. Candace? Yeah. Okay, fantastic. You can hear us. We can't hear you.
I'm Mandy,
Hi, Mandy. Can you hear us now?
Fantastic, yes.
but we still can't hear you.
Okay. So the problem, I think, is with the actual the laptop that is the control laptop, right? We've got three laptops. So we're just trying to get the third laptop.
It's not great sound quality.
Give
I
us
can
another
hear that
2
you-
minutes. I hope to have it.
Okay, I don't know if you're talking to us. It's quite terrible sound quality if you are. Hi, morning, everybody. I think you're wanting me to start. Is that right? Can one of the panelists just give me a thumbs up? Yes, perfect. Okay. Hi, everyone. So this is an interesting hybrid session, and we'll have to make do with a technology that is going to be a little bit challenging. So I'm not sure what Sapira has said. So I'll start off by just saying I am Mandy Barnett. I'm from the South African National Biodiversity Institute. Oh, sorry. Okay, let Sapira do her intro first. Okay, thanks. Okay. Okay, let's see if we can time it better this time. Good morning, everybody. Morning from Cape Town. I'm sorry I can't be with you in Egypt. I'd like to thank the NBI, the DFFE, and the DBSA for the opportunity to say a few words today about this very important topic, which is very close to our hearts at SANBI. And of course, that's the link between biodiversity, natural capital, and the just transition. So a little bit of background, because I'm sure not everybody in the room is familiar with the South African National Biodiversity Institute. We are a national entity of the National Department of Forestry, Fisheries and Environment in South Africa, with a mandate to work at the interface between science, policy and practice. We're also a direct access entity of the Adaptation Fund and the Green Climate Fund, working in particular with grant-based finance and with climate change adaptation. And this places us in a unique position to mobilize climate finance for South Africa in a way that focuses on biodiversity and the very specific linkages with the just transition and the climate resilient society part of the Just Transition program of work. So, it seems like the COP has been focusing a lot on the energy transition. We're working much more into the adaptation space and the space that is about delivering a climate resilient society. So a little bit of framing for the session. I just want to put a presentation up. If my technology doesn't fail me. So I want to just share my slide, and now I don't know how to do that. So that's not going to be very good, but let me just carry on then and just say that SANBI frames its work around this concept of ecological infrastructure, where we refer to ecological infrastructure as naturally functioning ecosystems that generate or deliver valuable services to people and the economy. So rather than just looking at the services that ecological infrastructure provides, we look at the underlying asset that delivers that service, and we talk about investing in that asset in order to deliver various outcomes for society. And the kinds of outcomes we think about and talk about are outcomes where we invest in restoring degraded catchments that then prevent siltation and prolong the life of dams. We invest in coastal dune infrastructure to protect settlements from storm surges. We invest in water security by investing in our catchments, looking at base loads and looking at the quality and quantity of water. We invest in landscapes that deliver soil and ecosystem health and improve food security. And we work on this notion that happy, healthy ecosystems and good, well-functioning ecological infrastructure provides a whole lot of benefits that are important for society. So how does this interface with the narrative of climate change? Well, if you look at the IPCC and the assessments that were done for the African sub-region, we can see very clearly how the increases in rainfall and the changes in temperature are going to impact ecosystems. It's going to impact the way that ecosystems function. And in turn, that functionality will impact the way that society experiences the various climate-induced hazards and events. So very specifically in South Africa, we know that we're going to be experiencing increased temperatures. We know that the rainfall patterns are changing. We know that in many places there'll be reduced rainfall, and in many places increased rainfall, but over fewer days. And what, of course, that means is much more intense rainfall events that cause floods, storms, siltation, etc., a whole lot of downstream impacts. And SANBI's work in adaptation is playing exactly into that space with a value proposition that says, if we invest in happy, healthy ecosystems, we can reduce the impacts of climate-induced risk. So we're currently working with a pipeline of proposals that we're developing for the Green Climate Fund. All of them have got this underlying value proposition of investing in ecological infrastructure, delivers resilience and reduces vulnerability of communities that would be impacted by these extreme events. And to give you two examples, the one is a project that's very far in the GCF pipeline. We're developing the full funding proposal at the moment, and it's an ECO-DRR project, ecosystem-based disaster risk reduction. And it's playing into the space where we recognize that climate change is going to cause increased fires, floods, and droughts. And if we look after our biodiversity and our ecosystems and our ecological infrastructure, we can reduce the impact of those fires, floods, and droughts on neighboring communities. So if we reduce fuel loads in the catchments, the fires will be less intense. If we look after our wetlands, they will do their job at slowing down stormwater, allowing the water to sink into the catchments and allowing the downstream impacts of intense flood events to be less. So that project is all about looking at how do we better manage our catchments, how do we work with the national departments that have got a mandate to do that, and how do we work with our disaster response personnel in our sub-national government municipalities so they can interface with this catchment management program of work and work towards protecting assets and lives in our communities. And the second project that I'll touch on very briefly is one where we're working into South Africa's strategic water source areas. So those of you that are from South Africa might be familiar with the term. In other countries, we talk about water towers. Essentially, it's the part of our landscape, often, well, always, the upper catchments that are our water factories. It's where our water comes from. And in South Africa, 10% of the land produces 50% of the water that feeds our dams, supports our economies, supports our communities, provides domestic water, and so on. And the value proposition of the second project is that if we invest in and secure our strategic water source areas through ecosystem improvements, restoration and rehabilitation activities, but also regulatory processes that stop us allowing land use change that is not supportive of the strategic water source areas to continue happening in those areas, we will be able to protect the very source of our water and deal with the massive water security issue that South Africa is facing. So in summary, and I'll be quick because I know that we're out of time here, SANBI's only working with grant-based finance, and we're working at the intersection of ecological infrastructure and the public good. We're very interested in partnering with others. We know that this is not the only piece of the value chain. It's the part that we're looking after, but we're really interested in talking to others, possibly in the room and others, around how other financial instruments and other partners can come into the space so we can develop holistic and systemic responses to the way in which we unlock the potential of ecological infrastructure to contribute to our just transition. Thank you so much.
Thank you for that, Mandy. Can we move over to Candice for her to give us a brief outline of the work they've been doing with the Sustainable Finance Coalition?
Thank you so much, Safira, and thank you for Mandy for setting the scene. I'm Candice Stevens. I have the privilege of chairing Africa's Sustainable Finance Coalition. And the coalition is essentially a driving force for the development of innovative financial solutions for land and seascapes. So the coalition really brings together a wealth of expertise and organizations from the public, private, and civil society sector for two main aims. The one is, if we're going to tackle large planetary challenges like biodiversity loss, climate change, and various other tipping points that we're facing, we can only do so together. It requires an enormous amount of collective action in order to address these challenges, and importantly, to create the flows of sustainable finance that we need to tackle the challenge at scale and with the impact in the places where it needs to be the most. So the coalition brings together a wealth of expertise across 17 different sectors, representing decision makers and experts from 12 African countries. And secondly, it really focuses on the development of innovative financial solutions. And we believe in having a full toolbox of finance solutions that would allow us to be able to plug the finance gap needed. So I want to build on what Mandy has iterated with regards to what healthy ecosystems do. I don't think we can overemphasize enough the role that nature plays in tackling our race to net zero, the importance of just transition, and importantly, being able to deal with the fallout that comes through climate change. And I think Mandy alluded to some of those critical risks that we're facing. Importantly, from a finance point of view, the role of nature is not just around being able to create nature-based solutions, but from a financial point of view, we simply cannot fill a bucket with a hole in it. If we continue to destroy functional landscapes and ecosystems, the impacts are ongoing from a biodiversity loss and climate change point of view, and we increase our finance gap around environmental interventions. So as we look to plug the finance gap around just transition, as we look to plug the finance gap for biodiversity conservation and all these intersecting issues, and importantly around emerging green sectors, we need to be cognizant that it's not just around innovating and developing financial solutions, but it's also around actually plugging that finance gap by not making it bigger. So every ecosystem that continues to be destroyed or disrupted in certain ways is going to increase the amount of finance that we need, because we need to undertake more conservation action and continue to innovate to plug that gap. So from the coalition's point of view, we really want to be able to tackle the finance gap that's needed to address these challenges in a twofold way. One is, how do we minimize the risks and the impacts that we're creating? And there's some important levers that we need to be able to pull in that space so that we plug the hole in the bucket and we don't continue to increase the amount of finance that we need in taking our work to scale. And then importantly, looking at the other side of that coin, which is the development of financial solutions that are going to aid us in addressing these issues. I think we're all well aware that there are large finance gaps in countries all over the world, but particularly in Africa, in addressing, one, our just transition, but importantly, in addressing other concerns such as biodiversity loss and the development of emerging green sectors. So with this in mind, there are three critical levers I believe that we need to be pulling in order to plug this hole in the bucket, to make that impact smaller, to make the finance gap smaller, and then importantly, to develop those finance solutions. So the first is a really critical look at our enabling policy and legislative frameworks. We need to be able to look at which incentives and subsidies are aligning with just transition and aligning with our response to planetary crises, and not see a continual drain, for example, from a fiscus that is going to counteract some of the finance solutions we want to put in place. We want to be able to see things like green finance taxonomies, both at home, where I'm from in South Africa, but around the world, building in green infrastructure, not just built infrastructure, into how we design finance solutions in this space. And there are a number of regulatory frameworks that need to keep up with capital markets, for example, in the carbon space. So there's a critical role as we develop and as we innovate around financial solutions, and as we plug that hole in the bucket, that we need to ensure that our policy, legislative and regulatory frameworks are keeping pace with these developments. Then the second is around collective action. Like I said from the very beginning, the coalition fosters a cohesive network around land and seascape finance. We need multidisciplinary approaches and all sectors on board if we're going to tackle these issues. And we're seeing some incredible innovations and collaborative problem solving that are coming out of the coalition and with various partners such as DBSA and others. And this is critically important to move effectively and to move as fast as possible in this race that we're seeking to meet net zero as fast as possible, and importantly, to speed up the just transition, which does require finance, and that collective action allows us to problem solve and build finance solutions that are tailor-made for context and have the specific skill sets that allow us to create those new finance solutions. And then lastly, we have to be very deliberate and very dedicated towards creating these new financial instruments. There is an enormous gap in, for example, the bond market for green sustainability linked and impact bonds, with enormous potential to grow in that space. But we need to be very deliberate about how we would create those new instruments and plug that gap, for example, in the bond market. The same may be said around carbon and other nature-based credits. There's a lot of talk around biodiversity credits and other, and it requires an enormous amount of deliberate dedication to get those in place. And then another example around the dedication that's required is when we have emerging green sectors, which are going to deliberately create new green jobs, we need to be able to address those barriers to entry for those emerging green sectors, which does require deliberation. So I'm really looking forward to the rest of the discussion. I'm sorry that I couldn't be there in person with everybody in Sharm el-Sheikh, but thank you very much for the opportunity to share.
Thank you very much, Candice. I think from our first two speakers, it's quite obvious that we need to do a great deal more work with respect to natural capital and nature-based solutions within the just transition. Just maybe to go through a few points, we do know, and I think the IUCN, a recent report that I read, said that nature-based solutions can provide over a third of the solutions that we need for the just transition and to mitigate and manage climate risks. We also know that nature-based solutions and natural capital have a key role to play from an ecological perspective as ecological infrastructure. And I think this is critically important for us, specifically because we often tend to look at infrastructure as the gray, hard, concrete infrastructure that we need. And in the just transition, when we talk about infrastructure, that's typically where we tend to go. However, we do know that ecological infrastructure and natural capital has a critical role. So the need to broaden how we define infrastructure is particularly important, and how we finance this infrastructure, and moving across to financing of natural capital and biodiversity as infrastructure is one of the key elements of our just transition. With that, I'm going to hand over to Tanya to take us through a bit of the work that they've been doing.
Thanks, Safira. This is working. Thanks, sir. Morning, everyone. As you heard, I'm from Investec. I've been there for 21 years, and what's interesting is how this space in particular has changed over that time. So if I think right back to 2002, The only thing we could talk about from an environmental perspective was probably a little bit of whatever we were doing around the building. There was absolutely no appreciation of natural resources and our role that we play as a financial sector, never mind operationally, but obviously through our businesses. So thinking back over those 21 years, we've certainly come a long way. Starting out, in the obvious philanthropy space. We've got a big project, Rhino Lifeline, which really houses all our conservation projects, and that was grown out of passion, for nature and for wildlife, and for an appreciation. The zebra is our brand, so wildlife is very close to our hearts, but an appreciation that if we're not protecting, that one species, what does that mean for us as a species? And since then, it's really grown and developed into a much broader perspective around, first and foremost, every single deal you're doing, are you taking this into consideration? So it doesn't matter, whether it's on a private client side, on the property side, on infrastructure side, doesn't matter where we are, we have to bring that lens to what we're doing. The second part is obviously operationally, within our own operational footprint. Fortunately for us, we have a very small footprint, so we're not replacing any protected areas. But the last one is, for me, what is the most exciting area, and that is where we can now actually play a role in financing some of these projects that we've just heard about. And I think, what we've seen to date is a lack of viability around projects, which makes it quite difficult. That can come down to, simple thing like scale. Projects just aren't big enough. They're in pilot phase. They need the financing to get them through a pilot phase before the banks will come in. So I think it's a similar model to, a lot of what's happening in the climate transition space and in the SDG space. There's that bottom layer of financing that helps in terms of the risks that the banks aren't able to take, and then it'll open it up for the retail banks. But certainly we are seeing a much greater consciousness in everything that we're doing in this space, and that's coming from both sides. That's coming from the client side, and from our side.
Thank you very much for that, Tanya. I think that raises the issue of project bankability and the project preparation that we need to invest in order to ensure that we have these natural capital, nature-based solution projects that we can bring to financial close, basically. Here, I'm going to hand over to Justine, who's going to speak to some of the reporting frameworks that we need that can also support the just transition and our natural capital projects.
Thank you. So just wanted to pick out a couple of points that each of the panelists have made. Mandy spoke about natural capital and the ecosystem services that they provide. Candace spoke about the importance of this in terms of climate resilience and the just transition. And Tanya's expanded on that in terms of sustainable financing. And I think the opportunities, where much of this conversation has been around the opportunity side of the discussion. I'd also just like to add to that, though, from a risk perspective, and linking this back to businesses and a financial institution even, is the risks that relate to natural capital and biodiversity. They underpin so many of our ecosystem services. They contribute enormously to GDP. And the risk that poses to businesses in terms of if our ecological infrastructure, if our ecosystem services and our biodiversity loss continues, there's a huge risk to businesses in terms of their supply chains, in terms of their raw materials for and inputs into their businesses and how it can impact the operations. So there's a clear link there in terms of resilience to business resilience and sustainability as well. So that leads me really to a discussion about, or just a brief introduction to the TNFD, which is a framework that looks at the management of risks from biodiversity loss and ecosystem degradation. So just bringing that risk lens into the discussion. I'm sure you've all heard of the TCFD being at the Climate COP, which is really the framework the recommended framework for disclosures around climate risks. So what the TNFD is trying to do is to bring this nature and biodiversity conversation into the mainstream and leverage off the work that's been done in the climate space. It's also trying to encourage thinking that climate and nature are not separate crises, they're interrelated. So trying to, again, link the discussion into existing frameworks and conversations that are happening within businesses and financial institutions. The TNFD, and I'm not sure if I said this already, looking at that, it's called the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosure. So just looking at the nature side rather than the climate side. Really looking at improving data quality and availability to integrate nature into decision-making in companies, and to support a shift in financial flows away from nature negative to nature positive. So again, like as I mentioned, you've got direct and supply chains impacts and dependencies. So really the framework is looking at how do you, as a business, start understanding where those impacts on nature and biodiversity are in your operations, and what are the dependencies. So Tanya's mentioned about the direct operational carbon footprint and operational environmental impacts, which is important to understand through your activities. Are you impacting a threatened or an area that is degraded, or a natural resource like water? Do you have an impact on water that is maybe scarce in that area? So it's important to understand what impact your operations may have on the environment. And again, for financial institutions, it goes even broader than that. It looks at your portfolio and your investments and locating where they are relative to sensitive areas or perhaps threatened species. So understanding those impacts, and then understanding the dependencies. As I mentioned, your supply chain might be reliant on raw materials like cotton or fiber or pollination for your agri portfolio. So there's a dependency on your clients, and if that's degraded, it obviously poses a threat to your their livelihoods, their credit risk. So definite dependencies need to be looked at. That then leads to the conversation of, well, risk management. How do you manage those risks? How do you integrate that into risk management frameworks that are already entrenched in your company? Again, we're not, the TNFD is not proposing this as an additional reporting or measurement framework. They're trying to suggest that it is integrated into existing frameworks, just bringing that nature consideration into it. And then once you've got an understanding of those impacts, dependencies, and risks, I think that leads nicely into the opportunities discussion. So you understand where your hotspots are, where your material risks are, where you have a material impact, or maybe an area that is environmentally sensitive and you need to focus on that. And then you can come up with the solutions to address those issues, to mitigate those impacts, and come up with important and innovative solutions to manage those. So I think I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much for that. I'm going to hand over to Deepak Patel, who's going to give us the perspectives of the work that's taking place within the Presidential Climate Commission.
Thank you very much. I'm going to try and pull back a little bit and maybe look at things from a top perspective. At the PCC, we quickly realized that the essence of the just transition was the place where mitigation, adaptation, climate resiliency formed a nexus. And I think the word nexus is very important, and I'll probably come back to that word later on in the discussion. But we understand that as a result of our ambitious statements with respect to decarbonization and greenhouse gas emissions reduction, that we necessarily had to follow a path of decarbonizing our electricity sector. Now, we also understand that our coal-generated power stations have caused biodiversity havoc in those areas where coal mining takes place, as well as where coal is burnt to produce electricity. And so for us, I suppose, as part of a consistent narrative would be, how do we return degradation in those areas at industrial scale back to some degree of normalcy or reverse that process. The second issue we understand is that our region of the world is going to be twice impacted compared to the rest of the world as it relates to global warming. And as we know, we have multiple biospheres in our geography. So we're impacted by ocean level rise. Equally, we're impacted by warming. We're impacted by severe flooding, followed by severe periods of drought. Now, all of this causes us to think of another nexus, and that is the nexus between water, energy, and food security. And when we look at this systemic set of issues, I think we realize that we need to find, as we seek both projects as well as financial solutions, the place where we can package in a meaningful and explainable way why biodiversity is so important. So I think we've graduated from a discussion on biodiversity for those of us who love the deep ocean to understand that it is not only about preserving the corals so that we can don our masks, fins, and tanks and dive there, but we're beginning to understand what the systemic impacts of biodiversity loss really look like. Now, as we deal with biodiversity loss, we need to then extend our thought with respect to what are the mitigating opportunities in biodiversity preservation, which are not easy to quantify in a typical project financing sense of the word. But when you take a systems view of the world, you can begin to find in financial terms, the value of investing in preservation, the value of investing in rehabilitation of forest areas, catchment areas, to ensure that the downstream water security issues are dealt with at source of the problem rather than in a costly way at the point of consumption. And I think the way in which we conceptualize these value chains is very, very important. The way in which we conceptualize individual projects linking into mitigation, linking in to whatever resources might be available through the fiscus in adaptation. But more importantly, as we look at what happened in KwaZulu-Natal during the floods, as we look at what is currently happening in the Eastern Cape with respect to drought, the drought crisis, we must pull backwards and see what are the biospheres that we need to pay attention to ensure that climate resiliency of our people as climate change impact begins to be felt. What are those opportunities to pull together in very creative ways, long-range projects, which then at least become part of the narrative of the mainstream responses to climate change.
Thank you very much for that. I think if we just look through what's been discussed so far, we've got the issues of ecological infrastructure, the nexus between climate, environment, natural capital, and society, and the importance of developing projects and finding that value in our natural capital to enable us to better integrate our natural capital into our just transition projects. I think that also speaks to the issue of net positive. We tend to get focused on the low carbon, not saying that we shouldn't, we must absolutely focus on our low carbon projects, but we need to also consider the net positive. So once we've reduced our carbon emissions, let's also make sure that we have a net positive impact for natural capital, for society as a whole. Without that, we're not going to be able to have our food systems or our natural capital catchment management, ecological infrastructure processes working very well. I think now that we have highlighted the key issues, and unfortunately, sorry about having to rush through the panel very quickly due to our technical difficulties at the beginning, but I think we have time for 1 or 2 questions. I'm not sure if anybody would like to ask a question.
Is this working? Great, thank you. Good morning, and thank you very much for a great presentation. My name is Mzila Mchenjane from Exxaro, and maybe just 1 point to make and 3 questions. I think the first one is to acknowledge the women leadership in terms of this role, and I don't know if it's a coincidence, But I think if it's deliberate, it should continue as such, because on the topic of biodiversity, Mother Nature, there's a connection there that maybe we can talk about. The second point is around a question of, I think there's still a debate around what we mean by just transition project. And maybe you can help me, perhaps Mandy, looking at it through the lens of biodiversity. What are you seeing to be a just transition project, and how nature can play a role in terms of providing a solution? That's my first question. And the second one to the financiers is around, I think something that is still going to be emerging and evolving around the risk sharing of these types of projects. I mean, you mentioned the issue of projects being at pilot phase, banks can't finance them. But I think these are projects that also need to be approached in a different way. It's not like, in the same way that when you're building a mine, you start from concept to pre-feasibility to bankable feasibility, but the mine takes on the initial equity of proving it up to a bankable. And how are you seeing the risks sharing in as far as financing these projects to eventually get them to the scale that you can get all the funding that you need? Thanks.
Thank you for that. Mandy, maybe you can take the first question and then we'll open it up to our panelists here.
Sure, thanks so much for the question, and I would love to answer that. I think when we think about climate change, we need to recognize that climate change, I often say, will exacerbate existing vulnerabilities. So if already you are someone who is experiencing poverty, unemployment, poor access to resources, any sorts of challenges like that, climate change is going to make it worse. And the just transition is defined as a transition to a low carbon economy and climate resilient society. Our work plays into the climate resilient society part. So we're all about saying, if we would look at the way that happy, healthy ecosystems interface with these vulnerable ecosystems interface with these vulnerable communities, the value proposition is that if we look after them better, they will be able to absorb some of the risk that is coming through climate-induced changes, changes in weather patterns, changes in rainfall, and so on. Of course, that's not the only place where biodiversity plays a role. There's a role for biodiversity in carbon sequestration. So I'm not talking too much about that today. I think the part that we really need to recognize, which is really obvious actually, when you look especially at our rural environments, at the perimeters of our urban environments, you can see exactly how nature interfaces with people who are impacted adversely by climate change. I mean, one of the panelists touched on the floods in Durban that happened recently. And, there's a very obvious story there that if the biodiversity had been looked after properly, if planning had happened in a way that was responsive to the environment and responsible, the likelihood of us having seen the kinds of impacts on those communities being as bad as they were would have been not as high. So that's how we understand it in SANBI. And maybe just to say, while I've got the floor, that I'm so encouraged to hear everybody adopting this similar language. And, there really seems to be a groundswell of understanding that investments in nature and ecological infrastructure can make these kinds of differences. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Mandy. Just to the point of gender and the panel and biodiversity, I think we all know that gender and women play a critically important role within the biodiversity and natural capital space. We know that with increased climate shocks, you have, shall we say, a decrease in social cohesion as people try to cope with what the climate hazards and climate shocks. And we do know that when we're in areas of conflict, or when we move into conflict space, women and children tend to bear the brunt of that. And that makes gender and biodiversity and the discussion around that even more important. We actually also had a panel on gender and biodiversity last week, which was actually very wonderful. But maybe to answer the last question on the financing.
While I've got the mic, I'm just the token diversity participant on this panel.
So I'd also like to add something to the first question on the just transition. Another angle to consider in that is, and as you say, women and children play a key role in the sort of biodiversity and nature conversation. but also in terms of the opportunities then and in terms of jobs and community support. I think, Nkiza, you were on a panel yesterday when you were talking about sort of the mining sector and decarbonization and replacing it with agriculture. I think there's a lot of opportunities that the nature and natural capital and a focus on that can provide. We're not saying, take jobs out of mining and put them into farming. We're saying when you look at these solutions and opportunities, make a concerted effort as well to look for the opportunities where we can involve women and communities and get them to leverage off the natural capital that they're a part of as well. So I think it'll take a concerted focus to do so. On the question of finance, I certainly can't speak to the de-risking of the finance side. I think maybe Tanya and Candace would be better to speak to that. But another angle to look at it is the de-risking the risk on the community and the client side. So if you're building resilience in communities and you're building resilience in the ecosystems, I think that's one way already to de-risk for the impacts of climate change. And then by nature, then you're somewhat de-risking the finance. But I think if I can pass over either to Tanya or Candace to speak to the financing side.
Yeah, all I would briefly say is I think for me, the crux of the matter is that we haven't really fully got our heads around how do we value nature? Because if we were including that in our calculations, we wouldn't be having this problem. So I think once we actually get, a much deeper understanding of how to value the inputs and what the benefits of the project are beyond just financial benefits, we'll get to a point where the returns aren't the only consideration.
And I can't resist but to retort. And from the PCC's point of view, if you look at the investment plan that was released 2 weeks ago by the president, there's a very much a strong focus on rehabilitation on mining lands. And here I have no option but to say, currently the PCC is doing an audit of all those mines that either have been abandoned or improperly shut down. And we're coming after the mine rehabilitation funds to make sure that the rehabilitation programs are properly funded by the people who created the liability in the first place.
Okay, Candace, if we can just have a quick 1 minute response from you. Sorry about this, but we've run out of time, but go ahead.
Thanks, Safira. So I think two critical things here. When we're looking at just transition and the role of biodiversity, we can't underestimate new emerging green sectors. There are a wealth of new opportunities in these green sectors that link to biodiversity in terms of sustainable use and various other natural resources that come out of whole and wholesome landscapes and seascapes. But in order to make those emerging green sectors work in creating jobs and being able to address climate risk and biodiversity loss, we need to be able to plug finance in. And there is this ongoing gap between the demand for capital and projects and nature-based solutions on the ground. And there are a couple of rungs to that bridge to pull that chasm together and link finance with nature. And one of those is around looking at de-risking finance, which comes down to how do we get those projects and nature-based solutions and enterprises investor ready from the one side, and from the other side, it's looking at where in the investment pipeline are they, so that we can speak to the appropriate source of finance and be able to adjust things like ticket size, risk profile. And so there really has to be a meeting of the minds in this space, which is one role that the coalition and various partners facilitate. But again, it takes a very deliberate and dedicated approach to be able to get projects, enterprises, and nature-based solutions to one half of the chasm, and then pull the financial sector, from various sources to the other side, so that there can be a meeting of the minds, and we start to de-risk that and see the flows of finance into those projects and those emerging sectors.
Thank you very much for that, Candace. I think in closure, if we think about the fact that we know that our natural capital is particularly important and is key to how we weather the climate shocks that are coming our way and how we move towards the just transition and Paris alignment, I think the de-risking, the financial aspects are critically important. We cannot ignore them. But I think trying to develop that pipeline, trying to create the projects, the project preparation that needs to go into this is just as important as having the discussions here, and bringing the stakeholders together as we've done so today is critically important. The finances, the scientists, the Presidential Climate Commission, getting everybody together is the one step going forward. And unfortunately, we've had to rush this panel somewhat, but what we will do is maybe we'll reconvene this when we all get back to South Africa and have a really comprehensive and deep discussion on this. But thank you, everybody. Thanks so much for coming. And I hope you enjoy the rest of Biodiversity Day.
The rehabilitation of mine is come running XRO after all. Oh, no, you've done. No.